The air inside the old jazz club was thick, heavy with the smell of polished wood, stale beer, and the faint, sweet scent of cigarette smoke that seemed to cling to the curtains even after years of being a non-smoking venue. It was a Tuesday night, which meant the open mic sessions were in full swing. For the musicians in the city, this was the place to be seen. It was a battlefield where young, hungry players tried to outdo each other, hoping to catch the eye of a producer or simply win the respect of the crowd. The low hum of conversation, mixed with the clinking of ice cubes in glasses. At the bar, men and women in their 20s and 30s leaned close to one another, speaking in hushed, urgent tones about scales, chords, and gigs. They were the cool crowd. They wore leather jackets, scarves even though it wasn't cold outside, and carefully styled messy hair. They carried their instrument cases like trophies, slung over their shoulders with a casual confidence that shouted, "I belong here." Into this loud, bright, and arrogant world walked a small, quiet figure. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and for a moment the draft from the street cooled the room. An elderly woman stepped inside. She looked to be in her late 70s, perhaps 80. She was not dressed for a stage. She wore a plain, beige cardigan that had seen better days, a simple button-down shirt, and loose-fitting trousers that hung comfortably around her waist. Her hair was white and thin, pulled back in a loose bun that sat low on her neck. She held onto the railing as she descended the few steps into the main floor, moving with a slow, deliberate pace. In one hand, she carried a violin case. It wasn't one of those sleek, modern fiberglass cases you see today. It was an old, battered thing covered in cracked black leather, the corners reinforced with brass that had turned a dull green with age. It looked heavy, and she leaned slightly to the left as she walked to compensate for the weight as she made her way through the tables. The noise level didn't drop, but the energy shifted. Eyes flicked toward her, and then quickly away. It was the look of dismissal. In a room full of young, sharp talent, she looked like someone who had taken a wrong turn on her way to the grocery store. A group of 3 young men sat near the stage, tuning their guitars. One of them, a guy with a goatee and a flashy electric guitar, watched her approach the sign-up sheet. He nudged his friend with his elbow and smirked. "Hey," he whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I think Grandma lost her way." His friend chuckled, not looking up from his phone. "Maybe she's looking for the bingo hall down the street." "She's got a violin case, though," the third one said, squinting his eyes. "You think she's playing?" "Right?" the first guy scoffed, shaking his head. "She's probably just dropping it off for her grandson. Or she's going to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star and ask for tips."
Oh.
Turning their attention back to their own instruments, dismissing her completely, the woman, whose name was Alina, did not seem to hear them. Or if she did not care. She had the kind of face that suggested she had seen enough of life to let a few rude comments bother her. Her eyes were calm, hidden behind a pair of thick glasses that slid slightly down her nose. She reached the small table at the side of the stage where the host, a young man with a buzz cut and a clipboard, was sitting. He looked up, expecting another eager student. When he saw Alina, his polite smile froze for a fraction of a second. "Hello, ma'am," he said, standing up out of habit. "Can I help you? Are you looking for someone?" Alina looked at him, her expression soft. She adjusted her glasses. "I am here for the open mic," she said. Her voice was quiet but steady, with a faint accent he couldn't quite place. The host blinked. He looked at the clipboard, then back at her. Oh, okay. That's great. We love having everyone participate." He stumbled over his words, trying to be polite but clearly confused. "Do you need a chair? Or a stand?" "Just a chair, please," she said, "and I will need a few minutes." "I signed up online." The host scanned his list. Sure enough, there it was. A simple entry. Alina, violin. He hadn't paid attention to it when he printed the list. He had assumed it was a young student, right? "Okay, Lena," he said, writing a small check mark next to her name. "We have a few people ahead of you. Probably about 20 minutes. You can wait anywhere you like." Thank you, Alina said simply. She turned and walked toward the back of the room. As she moved away, the host sat back down and shook his head at the bartender. I give her 5 minutes before she gets bored and leaves, he muttered. Or until she realizes this isn't a knitting circle. Alina found a small, round table in the darkest corner of the room, far away from the stage lights. She placed the heavy violin case gently on the floor beside her feet. A young waitress came over, looking a bit rushed. Hi, can I get you anything? The waitress asked, glancing at the stage where the first act was tuning up. It's just a water, please. Tap water's fine, Alina said, taking off her coat and folding it neatly over the back of her chair. You got it? The waitress hurried off. Alina sat in the shadows. The room was loud. A drummer was setting up his kit, making loud, rhythmic noises that echoed through the space. A saxophone player was running through scales that sounded like sharp, jagged lightning. Everyone was trying to be faster, louder, and more impressive than the person next to them. She watched them. Her face was unreadable, but if anyone had looked closely, they might have seen a flicker of amusement in her eyes. She saw the tension in their shoulders. She saw the way they looked around the room to see who was watching them. They were playing to the crowd, not the music. They were desperate to be liked. The show began. The host grabbed the microphone, his voice booming through the speakers, welcoming everyone and hyping up the energy. The first act was a punk rock band. They were loud and energetic. The crowd loved it, shouting and cheering. Then came a rapper who spit rhymes with incredible speed, followed by a soul singer with a powerful voice. Through it all, Alina sat still. She drank her water. She did not tap her foot. She did not clap loudly, just a polite, soft applause after each act. She was invisible. The young men at the front had forgotten about her entirely. They were too busy watching the girl on stage playing the harp, nodding their heads appreciatively because she was young and talented, and fit their mold of what a musician should look like. About 40 minutes passed. The host came back to the microphone. All right, everyone, we have a special treat coming up next, he announced, trying to sound excited even though he was just reading names off a list. Let's shift gears a little bit. Coming up to the stage, please welcome Alina. The applause that followed was polite but sparse. It was the kind of applause people give when they don't know who is about to perform. A scattering of claps. Most people just took a sip of their drinks or turned to talk to their friends. The young guy with the goatee rolled his eyes. Finally, he said to his friends, "Time for a bathroom break." Lena stood up in the back corner. The movement caught the eye of a few people near the back. They watched as she reached down and unlatched her violin case. The metal snaps made a crisp, loud sound in the quiet moment between songs. She lifted the lid. Inside, resting on faded blue velvet, was a violin. It didn't look like a shiny new instrument. The wood was dark, honey-colored and worn. The varnish was scratched in places, showing the wood underneath. It looked like an old friend. She picked it up, holding it not with the tight grip of a student, but with the loose, easy hold of someone who has held the instrument for a lifetime. She didn't bring a music stand. She didn't bring any sheet music. She walked toward the stage. The floorboards creaked under her sensible shoes. As she moved from the shadows of the back of the room into the bright light of the stage, she seemed to shrink even smaller against the large curtains. She had to climb 3 steps to get to the stage level. She did it slowly, carefully lifting her skirt slightly. The host, standing near the curtain, looked at her with concern. He walked over to the microphone stand to adjust it for her. It was set high for the 6-foot saxophone player who had just finished. "Here, let me get that for you," he said, lowering the mic all the way to the floor. He didn't ask if she needed a chair, assuming she would stand, as all the other players had. Alina looked at the microphone, then at him. "I will not need that," she said softly. "And I would like a chair, please. A simple one, without arms." The host looked surprised. "Oh, okay, a chair? Sure." He signaled to a stagehand, a bored-looking guy carrying cables. "Hey, bring a chair out. Quick," the audience began to murmur. A violinist who sits down? It was unusual. It reinforced the idea that she was old, frail, and perhaps not up to the physical demands of performing. The whispers started to ripple through the room. "She really playing?" someone asked. Must be a folk song or something, came the reply. Grandma's got a recital, the guy with the goatee shouted, causing a few people around him to laugh. The chair arrived. It was a plain wooden stool. Alina placed it right in the center of the spotlight. She sat down, smoothing her skirt. She arranged the violin on her shoulder. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for just a second. The room was still restless. People were talking. Glasses were clinking. The bartender was opening a bottle with a pop. No one was ready. The silence that followed the first deep, resonant note was heavy, pressing down on the room like a physical weight. It wasn't the polite silence of an audience waiting for a song to end so they could clap. It was the confused, stunned silence of people realizing they had made a terrible mistake. The sound hung in the smoky air, vibrating against the old brick walls, refusing to fade away. Alina sat on the wooden stool, her eyes closed, her body perfectly still except for her right arm. She drew the bow across the strings with a slow, steady motion. The sound was not scratchy or thin like a student's violin. It was lush, full of color and depth. It sounded like a cello sometimes, low and rumbling, and then, in the blink of an eye, it would soar high and clear, like a bird breaking through clouds at the front table. The young man with the electric guitar froze. He had been half-turned in his seat, one foot on the floor, ready to stand up and walk to the bar for another drink. Now, he sat glued to his chair, his mouth slightly open. He knew enough about music to know that what he was hearing was difficult. He watched her left hand on the neck of the violin. The fingers were old, the skin loose and spotted with age, but they moved with a speed and precision that were terrifying. They danced up and down the fingerboard, finding the exact spots for the notes without even looking. Is she actually good? His friend whispered, the words barely escaping his throat. He sounded scared, as if he had just seen a ghost. The guitarist didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stared. He saw the way her thumb stayed loose behind the neck of the instrument, a sign of relaxed technique that he struggled with himself. He saw the way her fingers hammered down, creating a crisp, clear staccato sound that rang out like bells. The smirk was gone from his face, replaced by a look of utter confusion. The grandma joke he had made a few minutes ago was now burning in his throat, making him feel small and foolish. The atmosphere in the club was changing rapidly. Usually, during open mic nights, the air was filled with distraction. People checked their phones. They ordered food. They shouted across the room to friends. But now, the phones were dark in hands. The waitress stood near the bar, holding a tray of empty glasses, forgetting to move. The bartender had stopped drying a glass, the towel hovering in mid-dash air. Alina played on. She didn't rush. She played with the confidence of someone who had been performing for longer than most of the people in the room had been alive. She started to play a melody that was complex and winding. It wasn't a simple pop song or a catchy radio tune. It sounded like something ancient, a story being told without words. The music swelled, getting louder, forcing the listeners to lean in. It was demanding their attention, and it was taking it. The host, who had been standing near the side of the stage with his arms crossed and a bored expression on his face, slowly uncrossed his arms. He looked at the clipboard in his hand, then back at the old woman on the stage. He had expected to have to cue the sound engineer to turn up the microphone, or perhaps help her if she got lost. But the sound engineer hadn't touched a slider. The violin was acoustic, raw, and natural, yet it was filling the huge room effortlessly. The host felt a strange, prickly sensation on the back of his neck. He realized he was witnessing something rare, something he might never see again in this little club. He stepped closer to the curtain, his eyes fixed on her. As the song moved into a faster section, the difficulty level skyrocketed. Elena's bow arm became a blur. She was playing fast runs notes, cascading down the scale like waterfalls. A violin student would have tripped over their own fingers. The notes would have blended together into a messy mush. But her notes were distinct. Every single one was clear, like pearls on a string. She was playing with a ferocity that seemed impossible for a woman of her age. Her face, which had looked so soft and grandmotherly a moment ago, was now intense. Her jaw was set, her eyebrows drawn together. She was fighting the music, wrestling with it, and winning. The young men at the front table were no longer whispering. They were sitting in absolute stillness. The one with the goatee was actually sweating. He was a professional, or at least he tried to be, and he knew that he could not do what she was doing. He watched her bow control. She was using the whole bow from the tip to the frog, moving from the string inches above it to dig deep into the wood for a gritty, powerful sound. She made it look easy, which is the hardest thing to do in music. He realized that this woman, this quiet stranger in the corner, was a master. The thought made his stomach churn with a mix of awe and shame. The rest of the audience was catching on too. A group of college students in the back who had been laughing loudly just minutes ago were now leaning forward over their table. They didn't know about technique or fingerings. They just knew what they felt. And what they felt was a chill running down their spines. The music was sad but strong. It felt like a memory of a place they had never been but missed desperately. It was the kind of music that makes you think of old loves, lost chances, in the passage of time. Elena's eyes remained closed. She was in her own world. She wasn't performing for them. She was performing for the music itself. She played a series of chords, double stops that made the violin sound like 2 or 3 instruments playing at once. The harmony was rich and strange. It created a tension that made everyone hold their breath. They were waiting for the resolution, for the music to relax, but she kept them hanging there, balanced on the edge of a cliff. The lighting technician, who was used to following the movements of energetic rock bands, didn't know what to do. He usually flashed bright, colorful lights to match the beat. But there was no beat here, just a flowing river of sound. So, he did the only thing that made sense. He dimmed all the flashy spotlights. He turned down the purple and blue gels. He left just a single, warm white light focused on Elena. Suddenly, the dark corners of the club seemed to disappear. It was just her and the violin, floating in a pool of light. The smoke in the air caught the light, swirling gently around her, making her look almost magical in that light. The age of her hands and the wrinkles on her face didn't look like signs of weakness anymore. They looked like a map. Every line on her face seemed to say, "I have lived. I have suffered. I have joyed." The music was the sound of that life pouring out. The audience stopped seeing an old lady. They saw a giant. They saw a force of nature. A young couple sitting near the stage stopped holding hands. They were too entranced to even touch each other. The girl had tears in her eyes, though she didn't know why. The music was just that beautiful. It was bypassing her brain and going straight to her heart. She looked at her boyfriend, and he looked back, both of them sharing a moment of wonder. They had come out for a fun night of drinking and music, hoping to hear some cool covers. Instead, they were being given a gift they hadn't asked for, but desperately needed. The silence in the room was now complete. Even the ice in the buckets behind the bar had stopped melting. The air conditioner seemed to hum quieter. The city noise outside, sirens, car horns, shouting, seemed to vanish, unable to penetrate the barrier of sound that Elena had created. She was in total command. With a flick of her wrist, she could make them cry, and with a sharp, rhythmic plucking of the string spitzkatosh, she made their hearts race. She was playing with the emotions of 100 people, twisting them like clay. She began a section of the song that was incredibly fast, a flurry of notes that sounded like a storm. Her left hand was moving so fast it was almost a blur. The physical effort it took was immense. A young person would be breathing hard, their chest heaving. But Elena sat straight, her breathing controlled and rhythmic. She had stamina born from decades of discipline. She had spent thousands of hours in a practice room, alone, repeating these same patterns until they were part of her DNA. The critics in the room, the self-appointed experts who always judged every note, were silent. They had no criticisms to offer. There was nothing to fix. The intonation was perfect. Every note was exactly in tune. The tone was gorgeous. The phrasing was natural, like a human voice speaking. They realized that their concept of what a musician looked like had been shattered. They thought talent looked like youth, like leather jackets and trendy haircuts. They were wrong. Talent looked like a gray-haired woman in a beige cardigan sitting on a stool, pouring her soul out through 4 strings as she navigated the most difficult part of the piece, her bow jumping across the strings in a technique called spiccato, creating a bouncing staccato rhythm. The tension in the room reached its breaking point. Everyone was on the edge of their seats. The young guitarist was gripping his knees so hard his knuckles were white. He was terrified she would miss a note, terrified the spell would break. But she didn't miss. She didn't falter. She flew through the storm of notes and came out the other side, landing on a long, high note that shimmered in the air like a star. She held that note. She let it ring out, changing the pressure of her bow ever so slightly to make the note waver and grow, adding a gentle vibrato that sounded like a heartbeat. The sound seemed to go on forever. No one wanted it to end. The host stood motionless, realizing that he was witnessing a moment that defined his career as a booker, even if he didn't fully. The long, high note that Alina held seemed to hang in the air like a star suspended in the night sky. It didn't fade away quickly. It rang out with a pure, piercing sweetness that made the glasses on the tables vibrate softly. Just when the audience thought the sound was about to die, she drew her bow again, bringing the melody down from the heights into a deep, sorrowful valley. The mood in the club shifted instantly. The fast, flashy technical display was over, and now the music was settling into something much heavier. It wasn't about showing off anymore. It was about telling a story. The notes became slower, dragging a bit, like footsteps of someone who is tired but refuses to stop walking. The sound was rich and dark, full of a kind of sadness that didn't feel depressing. Instead, it felt comforting. It felt like the sadness you feel when you look at old photographs or think about people you used to love but don't see anymore. The young man with the goatee sat forward in his chair, his elbows resting on his knees. He had stopped worrying about his drink or his friends. His eyes were locked on Elena's left hand. He watched as her fingers pressed down on the strings, creating a vibrato, a slight, shaking wiggle of the finger that makes the note waver. It is a difficult technique to do well. Most students shake their hands too much, making the sound wobble like a sick goat. But Elena's vibrato was smooth and even, like waves lapping against a shore. It gave the note a voice, a human quality. It sounded as if the violin was crying, but not from pain, from a deep, ancient memory. He realized then that he had been wrong about everything. He looked at his own electric guitar, leaning against the amplifier. It was a beautiful instrument, expensive and flashy. But suddenly, it looked cold and dead to him. He played music to be cool, to get girls, to be the center of attention. He played with volume and distortion to hide his mistakes. Alina, on the other hand, had nowhere to hide. There was just her and the wood and the strings. She was putting her soul out in the open, naked and raw, for everyone to see. He felt a hot flush of embarrassment crawl up his neck. He realized that despite all his expensive gear and his trendy clothes, he was the amateur and she was the master, the bartender. A man who had heard thousands of bands in this dusty club leaned against the back counter, wiping a glass with a rag that wasn't dirty. He stopped pretending to work. He had seen many talented musicians pass through drunk geniuses, sober virtuosos, young prodigies, and aging legends. But he had never felt anything like this. The music seemed to bypass his ears and go straight into his chest. He found himself thinking about his own father, who had passed away years ago. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the melancholy tone of the violin, or perhaps it was the sight of Alina, a woman old enough to be his grandmother, pouring so much heart into her performance. He felt a sting in his eyes and quickly looked down, blinking it away. He wasn't the only one. Around the room, people were wiping their eyes or biting their lips, trying to maintain their composure. The silence in the room was different now. Before, it was a silence of shock. Now, it was a silence of respect. No one wanted to ruin the moment by coughing or shifting in their chair. The air conditioning seemed to hum in the background, keeping a low, steady rhythm, but even that seemed to fade away. The only thing that mattered was the sound coming from the stage. Elena's eyes were still closed. Her face was peaceful. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't frowning either. She looked like a person who was remembering a beautiful dream. She swayed slightly, her body moving with the phrase of the music. It was a subtle movement, barely there, but it showed how connected she was to the instrument. She wasn't playing the violin. The violin was playing her. She was just the vessel, the tool that the music used to reach the world. She began to play a series of chords, deep and low. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, up the legs of the chairs, and into the bodies of the audience. It felt like a heartbeat. Thump thump. The rhythm was slow and steady. It was the sound of the earth turning, of time passing. She played a melody above this rhythm that was simple and heartbreaking. It was a tune that felt familiar, like a lullaby everyone hears as a child but forgets as they grow up. A young woman in the back, who had been scrolling through her phone just 10 minutes ago, now held the device tightly in her hand, the screen dark. She wasn't looking at it. She was staring at the stage, her mouth slightly open. She had come to the club to escape her apartment, to listen to some noise so she didn't have to think about her stressful job and her mounting bills. But this music forced her to think. It forced her to feel. She felt the stress melting out of her shoulders. She felt the tightness in her chest loosen. For the first time in months, she wasn't worrying about tomorrow. She was just here, in this moment, listening to a sad, beautiful song played by an old woman she didn't know. It felt like a therapy session she didn't know she needed. As the song progressed, Elena began to play faster again, but it wasn't the frantic speed of before. This was a building of tension. The music became angry, sharp, and loud. She attacked the strings with the bow, digging the horsehair deep into the wood. The sound grew rough and scratchy on purpose, adding a texture of grit and pain. She played dissonant notes that clashed against each other, creating a sound that felt wrong but right. It was the sound of an argument, of a storm, of a heartbreaking. The young guitarist watched her right arm. He saw the muscles in her forearm tense and release. He saw the sweat forming on her brow. She was working hard. This music wasn't easy. It was physically demanding. He knew that his arm would be aching after 2 minutes of playing like that. But she didn't stop. She pushed through the difficulty, channeling her physical effort into the emotion of the piece. It was inspiring. It was terrifying. It made him want to go home and practice, but it also made him want to quit, because he knew he could never reach that level of artistry. The host stood near the side of the stage, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. He had forgotten all about his clipboard. He had forgotten about the schedule, about the next act waiting in the wings, about the bar tab running low. He was completely mesmerized. He watched the way the spotlight caught the dust motes dancing around Elena's head. She looked like a painting. He thought about all the times he had looked at elderly people and saw only their frailty. He saw them as people who needed help crossing the street, people who sat on park benches feeding birds. He had never looked at them and seen a reservoir of passion, a history of triumph and failure, a lifetime of stories. Elena was showing him that age doesn't kill the fire. It just burns differently, more steadily, and with more heat. She suddenly stopped playing. She lifted her bow off the strings, and the sound cut off instantly. The silence that rushed back in was deafening. It was like being underwater. The audience held their breath, waiting. Was it over? Was she done? Elena sat still for a moment, her chest rising and falling visibly. She looked tired, but energized. She looked at the violin, caressing the wood gently with her left hand, as if thanking it for its hard work. Then, without warning, she plunged back into the melody. But this time, it was the most beautiful part of the song. It was a resolution, a return to the light after the storm. She played high up on the neck of the violin, where the notes are close together and the space for fingers is tiny. The sound was thin and pure, like a whistle. It sounded like hope. It was the sound of the sun coming out after a week of rain. The melody soared, climbing higher and higher, defying gravity. The tension in the room released. People exhaled. The young woman in the back felt a tear roll down her cheek and didn't wipe it away. The bartender closed his eyes and let the music wash over him. The young man with the goatee felt a lump in his throat. He remembered why he started playing music in the first place. It wasn't to be cool. It was because of a moment like this, a moment he had heard on a record once that made him feel like he wasn't alone. He had lost that feeling along the way, buried under the need to impress others. This old woman, this stranger, had given that feeling back to him in 5 minutes. He felt a grudging respect, then a deep admiration, and finally, a sense of gratitude. Elena's face softened as she played the final phrases. The music slowed down, winding down like a clock running out of time. She played a sequence of descending notes, each one softer than the last, until she was barely touching the strings. She was whispering with the violin now, sharing a secret with the room. The light from the spotlight caught the side of her face, illuminating the wrinkles around her eyes and mouth. To the audience, those wrinkles were no longer signs of age. They were the topography of her life. Every line was a road she had traveled, a heartache she had survived, a joy she had experienced. She wasn't just playing notes, she was playing her life. And the audience was privileged enough to be listening. She played the very last note. It was a low, open G string, deep and resonant. She didn't lift her bow. She let the note ring out, slowly fading into silence. She sat there, motionless, her hand still holding the bow against the string. The note became softer and softer, a ghost of a sound, until it disappeared completely, dissolving into the air of the club. When Elena finally lowered her bow, the strings stopped vibrating, but the air in the room seemed to keep humming. It was as if the music had left a stain on the silence, a mark that couldn't be wiped away. She sat on the stool for a moment, her shoulders dropping as the tension left her body. She looked small again, just a tired woman in a beige cardigan. The magic that had made her look like a giant was gone, stored back inside the worn wooden case at her feet. For about 3 seconds, there was absolute stillness. It was the kind of quiet where you can hear your own blood rushing in your ears. The audience was frozen, caught in the wake of what they had just experienced. Their minds were trying to catch up with their hearts. They were processing the fact that they had just been transported to another world by a woman they had ignored. Then, sound broke the spell. It wasn't a shout or a cheer. It was the sharp snap of the waitress putting her tray down on a table. The sound seemed to wake everyone up. The explosion started at the front. The young man with the goatee didn't just clap. He stood up. He pushed his chair back with such force that it scraped loudly against the floor, but he didn't care. He slammed his hands together, staring at Elena with eyes that were wide and wet. His friends, seeing him stand, jumped up too. They weren't laughing anymore. They were clapping with a desperate kind of energy, as if trying to apologize with their hands. The standing ovation moved backward, like a wave. One table stood, then the next, then the next. Within seconds, the entire club was on its feet. The sound was deafening. It wasn't the polite clapping for manners applause they had given the other acts. It was a roar. It was the sound of 100 people realizing they had witnessed something historic. Whistles pierced the air, deep cheers rumbled from the men, and high cries came from the women. The bartender was banging on the bar with his fist, adding a rhythmic thud to the chaos. The lighting technician, lost in the moment, flashed the bright spotlights on and off in a frantic salute. Elena opened her eyes. She looked out at the wall of sound. For a moment, she looked confused, as if she had woken up from a deep sleep and didn't know where she was. Then, a small, shy smile touched her lips. It wasn't a smile of pride. It was a smile of gratitude. She nodded slowly, acknowledging the crowd. She didn't raise her arms in victory. She didn't bow theatrically. She just sat there and accepted their love with a quiet grace. The host, who had been standing near the curtain with his mouth open, finally snapped into action. He felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him. He remembered his condescending thoughts, his assumption that she was lost or confused. He felt hot with shame. He walked quickly onto the stage, the microphone cord trailing behind him. He reached Elena and leaned down, speaking close to her ears so she could hear him over the noise. He didn't use his host voice. Spoke like a humble student talking to a teacher. That was incredible, he stammered, his face red. Truly incredible. Do you want to say anything? I can adjust the mic for you. Elena looked at him. Her eyes were kind. She could see the embarrassment in his face. She could see that he felt bad. She reached out and gently patted his arm. "No words," she said softly. The music said enough. "Thank you for letting me play." The host nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He straightened up and faced the crowd, raising his hands to try and quiet them down. But the crowd didn't want to stop. They wanted to keep clapping. They wanted to make sure she knew how sorry they were for underestimating her. The host had to signal the sound engineer to cut the music, hoping the lack of background noise would eventually settle the room. Slowly, painfully, the applause began to fade, turning into a rhythmic clapping and then finally into a restless, buzzing silence. "She asked me to tell you," the host said into the microphone, his voice shaking slightly, "that the music says enough. And honestly, I think she's right." Another round of cheers erupted, shorter this time. Alina stood up from the stool. She was moving slowly now. The adrenaline that had fueled her performance was fading, leaving her feeling her age. Her knees were stiff and her back ached. She carefully placed the violin back into its case. She treated it with such tenderness, wiping it down with a soft cloth before laying it on the velvet. She snapped the latches shut. The sound was final. The show was over as she walked across the stage toward the steps. The young men at the front table watched her with reverence. The guy with the goatee wanted to say something. He wanted to stop her and tell her that she changed his life. He wanted to ask her who she was, where she studied, and why he had never seen her before. But the words were stuck in his throat. He felt too small to speak to her. He just watched her walk by, feeling like he was in the presence of royalty. When Alina stepped off the stage and back into the main floor of the club, the atmosphere around her changed instantly. It was like Moses parting the Red Sea. The crowd physically parted for her. People stepped back, clearing a path to the door. No one bumped into her. No one spilled a drink. They watched her with wide eyes, afraid to touch her, as if touching her might break the spell. She walked slowly through the gauntlet of admirers. A young woman reached out a hand, wanting to touch her shoulder, then pulled it back, thinking better of it. An older man, a regular who usually sat in the back and complained about the noise, simply took off his hat and held it against his chest as she passed. It was a silent salute. The host hurried down the side stairs, trying to catch up to her. He wanted to get her number. He wanted to beg her to come back next week. He wanted to offer her a headlining spot, a paycheck, anything to keep her talent associated with his club. "Excuse me?" "Alina," he called out, dodging a waiter. She stopped near the door, turning around to face him. The club was buzzing now that the music had stopped. People were talking excitedly, looking at their phones, trying to find out who she was. But the space around Alina and the host was quiet. "I'm sorry if I was rude earlier," the host started, breathless. "I didn't know." "None of us knew." That was the best thing I've ever heard in this place. "Please, we need to get your information. Do you have a card? Can we book you for a proper show? A weekend slot." Alina looked at him. She saw the genuine admiration in his eyes. She saw that he wasn't just trying to make money off her. He was truly moved. She smiled, a tired but genuine smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "I play for the music, young man, not for the slots. I do not have a card. I do not have a website. I am just an old woman who likes to play." "You're not just an old woman," he insisted. "You're a master. Please, if you ever want to play again, just come to the front of the line. No waiting. No sign-up sheet. You play whenever you want." Lena nodded softly. "Thank you," she said. "That is very kind." "But wait," the host said, desperate to keep the conversation going. "Who are you? Where did you learn to play like that? You have to tell us. People are going to ask." Alina adjusted her grip on the violin case handle. She looked around the room at the young faces, the bright lights, the expensive instruments. She remembered a time when she was one of them, hungry for recognition, desperate to be known. She remembered the orchestra halls, the velvet curtains, the applause. But that was a different life. A life that had faded away like the last note of her song. "I have played in many places," she said simply. "I have played for kings and I have played for empty rooms. Today I played for you. That is all that matters." With that, she turned and pushed the heavy door open. The cool night air rushed in, smelling of rain and asphalt. It blew against her face, cooling her flushed skin. She stepped out into the night. Leaving the noise and the heat of the club behind, the host stood at the door, watching her go. He didn't try to follow her. He felt that he couldn't. She belonged to a different world now. He turned back to the room. The buzz was getting louder. People were clustering in groups, talking animatedly. The mood of the night had completely shifted. The cynical, cool atmosphere was gone. It had been replaced by something raw and real. The young musicians were looking at their instruments differently. The girl with the phone was staring at the empty stage, lost in thought. The skeptic with the goatee was sitting quietly, turning his glass of beer around and around, deep in thought. The host walked back to the stage, feeling lightheaded. He picked up the microphone. He didn't know what to say. How do you follow an act like that? How do you go back to announcing drunk college bands after you've seen a ghost of music's past? Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice soft, I don't even know what to say. I think we all just learned a lesson tonight about judging books by their covers. A few people clapped, but it was weak. No one wanted the night to continue. They knew that nothing else would be as good. I need a few minutes to reset, the host lied. He just needed a moment to breathe. Give me 5 minutes. He walked off the stage and went to the bar. The bartender poured him a glass of water without asking. The bartender looked shaken. Who was she? The bartender asked, his voice low. I don't know, the host replied, drinking the water in one gulp. But she just humbled every single person in this room. Outside, Alina walked down the street. The city was alive, cars honking, sirens wailing, people rushing home from work. But she walked at her own pace. She felt tired.